Jason Fleming, I've been on over 100 podcasts, and it's one of the greatest ways to get leads. It's a quality, not a quantity game. So forget this Facebook ninja, TikTok advertising, pay a whole bunch and maybe get nothing in return. If you can get on the right podcasts, even if you get 5 or 10 leads, they'll be the best 5 or 10 leads you get. You could sell a lot of high ticket stuff, make a lot of big deals. You can make millions off of a few key podcasts. So on this video, I'm going to tell you the 2 things you need to do to be successful. The first thing is to get on the podcast. And then the second, in my opinion, more important thing, what to do once you get on the podcast. So let's roll up our sleeves and let's get to work. Now, the first thing is, how do you get on a podcast? Well, believe it or not, starting your own podcast is the easiest way to get on other people's podcasts. So do a few episodes yourself. It will give you good practice, good reps, and then invite other people to your podcast. And then in return, they will be more likely to reciprocate with you when you ask, hey, also, can I come onto your podcast? And they don't necessarily care. People don't really care too much that do podcasting. They're really enthusiastic about podcasting, so they don't do a matching thing. They're like, well, how many people listen to your podcast? This is how many people that listen to mine. And until you have this amount of people, I won't do a podcast with you. There's a lot of people where they have listeners that are more than the listeners you have, because you probably don't have any listeners on your podcast. That doesn't matter. So you can start small and continue to trade up. So you can work a deal with this podcaster. Then you can look at the people that they've interviewed and had as guests on their podcaster, and then see if they also have a podcast. And then reach out to them and get on their podcast as well, or at least ask them, hey, if you ever have an opening, I would love to be the person you consider for the podcast. This is what I can talk about, and give them the very brief ABC of what you do, which is what we're going to now break down in terms of content. But hopefully that makes clear. Start and get on everybody's podcast. It is a good way to influence your communication skills so you can get better at them, and to make connections with people that can become very valuable for you as you go down the line. Now let's get into what matters the most. Not booking the podcast. It's what you say once you get on the podcast that will make or break you. So let's say you book the podcast. We have to work backwards. What are you going to promote at the end of the podcast? Now, the very best thing in the world for most people to promote at the end of the podcast is a book, an actual hardcover written book. It can be on Kindle as well. But as long as you can say, go to Amazon and get my book, then by far, there is nothing better that you can do on a podcast than offer a book. Now, I get it. You probably don't got a book. Okay, well then what's the next best thing that you can offer on a podcast? The next best thing that you can offer on a podcast, especially when you're starting off, is a free discovery call. Now, you can't appear too eager. It can't be like, here's my phone number, please call me, because people are like, you can't be that cool if you're begging me to call you. But you can make it appear as if there's a process for booking where you can say, hey, I'm looking for a few like-minded people that I can partner with. If so, I can give out a phone number that you can connect with, and you can send a text message to, and we can go for there to see if it's a right fit or not. You didn't say it's your personal phone number, even though it probably is when you're starting off at first. You make it appear as if there's a booking process and a discovery and exploratory phase. And you might say, Jason, that's insane to give out a phone number. Listen, you ain't famous yet. Nobody's texting you right now trying to give you money. Trust me, if you get a couple people that heard you on a podcast, they're going to be the highest quality leads, most likely to convert because they've already spent a lot of time with you. And so you're going to want to reach out to those people. And then after that, the worst thing that you could have happen to you is, oh my God, I get too many leads. I hope that happens to you. I hope you have to change your cell phone number because you have too many people trying to give you money. I mean, it ain't going to happen, but if it does, send me a thank you card for Christmas, okay? So if you don't got a book, have them text you. If that is a little too uncomfortable for you, then what you should do is have a one sheet. What I mean specifically is like a process map. I call it a placemat, where it's like, when you go at a restaurant and you sit down and the kids are there and they're coloring on it and it has activities and everything. If you have a placemat, essentially of your operation or your process or your system of the thing that you do, here's how this is awesome. Your whole podcast content will be based around that placemat. You could say, okay, on this podcast today, I would like to discover the XYZ process on how to ABC. And I developed a whole flow chart. So if you don't mind, can we go through it step by step? And the podcast host is going to say, great. And whether this is audio and you're just using it as a map to know where to go next, or if it's a video podcast and you can actually show the placemat, doesn't really matter. What matters is the listener hears a very distinct process They know you're going off a map. And guess what they'll want? They'll want the map. And guess what you just so happen to have at the end of the podcast? A way for them to download the map. Now, what most people are going to want to do is put it behind an opt-in, a squeeze page as we call it. So, go to xyz.com and get my map, get my placemat, get my whatever you want to call it. And then they say, give me your email address once you get there. I wouldn't recommend you do that. Let people just download it freely. Inside the placemat, put your contact information. You will not get as many opt-ins that way, but you will get more of the right kind of prospects who are interested in doing business with you. So those are your 3 best things. Don't give away ebooks. Nobody cares about an ebook. They just listen to you for 45 or 50 minutes. So give away a real book because they'll want to go buy it on Amazon, not from you and your goofy little website. If you can't do that, give them a way to text message you. By the way, if you have international clouds, WhatsApp is even better. But give them a way to start a dialogue with you, the highest quality leads, and prompt them on what they could dialogue with you, or get a placemat. Use the placemat as your content flow in the podcast, and then allow them to download the map from you at the end. Now let's get a little bit more into the weeds. Say you're on a podcast. What are some of the things you can do to get the best experience for the host, get the most engaging content for the user that also then converts them into a client? The first thing that you're going to want to practice at is in your introduction. Don't let them freestyle for you. Write out your own introduction and insist that they read it as is. Otherwise, God knows what you're going to get. I've had some of the weirdest introductions you've ever heard of in your life because that person that day wanted to talk about something that did not make me look good. Some silly story that didn't set up the conversation or anything. So literally write it out. The problem with most podcasts is their introductions are too long. So the user gets bored, or the listener gets bored before you even open up your mouth, and then they associate that feeling of bored with you as soon as you begin to talk. So you want a nice, quick, tight, punchy introduction. And here's what you want to do, because now you know how they're going to set you up. You know how they're going to hand over the baton to you. You're going to want to immediately start with as many open loops as possible. So you're going to say, thanks for having me. Today on this podcast, here are the areas I'd like to focus in. First, I'd like to discuss A, and then I'd like to, if we have time, go over B. And then if we have even more time left over, I'd like to explore C. Does that sound good to you? And you kick it back to the podcast host. And what you've done in the first few seconds of this podcast is you've given the audience these open loops. Okay, what's A? What's B? What's C? I want to know the answers to each of these things. Now, there's a fine line of communication you want to walk here. You don't want to sound like a sales letter, because that's weird. That is awkward when it comes to a podcast. People don't want to hear an advertisement in a podcast. So you have to not be like your hardcore normal bullet points. On this podcast today, you're going to discover the 7-step secret so you can finally eradicate fat from your ass once and for all, blah, blah. Nobody talks like that in real life, right? But you're going to say, we're going to dive into the 3 areas that have the most effect when it comes to X, specifically area 1, area 2, and area 3. And as we go through it, if we have time on this podcast, we can explore further in each of these areas. How does that sound to you? They say, good, but it's the same effect. It's a, hey, what's the answer to that? I got to hang into the podcast to figure it out. The next step is you got to know your audience. As you get bigger and bigger and bigger, this is irrelevant to you because you're not going to have time for every podcast you go on to get down and listen to the podcast episodes with other guests, get an understanding of who the listener is that would be on this podcast. But at first, all you got is time. Until you start making big money, you either have big money or big time. You don't have both. You have a deficiency in one or the other. And so you really want to, as much as possible, drill down to that audience. Who's that listener? Ask the host if you can, but more importantly, listen to and take note of the topics of the other guests that have been on that podcast. And also notice that host, what they stand for, and who are they most likely to attract. And then just be careful to try to phrase your content, your general flow of content, into the language that the customer would understand. So when I'm on branding podcast, I don't speak direct marketing. But when I'm on direct marketing podcast, I don't speak branding. When I'm on like the ultra hardcore business podcast, we get into more of the tactics. When I'm on the broader business stuff, we get into more of the strategy. It's the same map, but the details on the map are changed based on the audience that we're reaching out to. If you're not going to go ultra specific, which I absolutely recommend you do, and you just want to try to shortcut the process, then learn to speak as broad as possible, because then you can cast as wide of net to capture everybody. This typically means that you use a lot of analogies, you use a lot of metaphors and similes, and you tell a lot of stories, because everybody likes stories. And if you're using metaphors and analogies, you are making something that's unknown to them, you're connecting it to something that is known to them, and that makes it easier for them to understand what you're saying. If nothing else, master stories. What you want to have is 3 stories on a podcast. You want each of those stories to tap into a key dominant emotion. So you don't want 3 sad stories. You want a sad story, you want a happy story, and maybe you want a revenge story. Revenge stories are really great on podcasts because the user is like, yeah, I want to be that person in that story. You can have the reluctant hero story. I don't really care. Just have 3 different stories that tap into 3 different emotions. Because there's this saying that people don't really remember what you say, but they remember how they felt when they heard you say it. And if we can get them to feel 3 deep emotions, they'll say, man, this person was a great podcaster. What did they talk about? I don't remember what they talked about, but I felt moved inside. And part of the reason they feel moved is because they just felt 3 emotions when typically they don't feel any emotions when they listen to podcasts. You could have a cheat sheet. This can help you a lot, not just with the stories, but with quotes. If you say a quote from somebody else, it's almost as if you invented it yourself. It is amazing what listeners will attribute to you if you're quoting somebody else, as if you were as smart as the person you quoted. So there's a Churchill quote that I use all the time. I say, the truth is incontrovertible. Malice may attack it. Ignorance may deride it. But in the end, there it is. And I can pull that quote out whenever I want to. It's in my back pocket. I can just drop it in easy as pie. And they're like, wow, I mean, I'm not Churchill, but I'm almost like Churchill simply because I can quote Churchill. This is really good because it will help you develop your own sound bites over time. So you should have a whole bunch of quotes and one-liners ready to pull out at a moment's notice. Like, there's something I always say that gets positive applause when I'm speaking in front of audiences, and it goes like this. I say, before you can sell the plan to heaven, you got to provide the path out of hell. So I have a list of one-liners that I can use on any podcast, and people will remember those zingers. Humor is also really big. You should sit down and you should think laughs per minute. How many laughs per minute could I get? When I make a point, can I make it humorous? This is different typically than most marketing. Most marketing and selling, if you're humorous, people are in pain. They don't laugh their way out of pain. So you sell pain with pain. But on podcasts, where people are not being directly sold to, humor is one of your greatest leverage points because they'll like you because they laugh when they listen to you. And you might say, well, Jason, I'm not very funny. 2 things to that. One is be self-deprecating. Make fun of yourself. And that's some of the easiest humor that you can have. It also makes you more relatable. But the second thing too is use existing jokes. The best way to get jokes from materials, look up YouTube videos, and in the comments, there's always some smart ass that has some really good zinger. And you can use that as fodder yourself. You can say, well, some people, when you say this, will say that, and then you can quote somebody from a comments. It's really easy these days to crowdsource humor. Just be intentional with your humor. Use vocal variety. So don't always talk at the same tone and the same rate, because then people will just drone you out. So, sometimes you get really excited and you speak really fast. And other times, to prove a point, you slow down. And then you can get really loud and you can get really quiet and you can change the melody of your voice as well. There's a formula for communication that you should get used to using to make any point more powerful. And I use this in every form of communication. It's set up, pay off, tie down. So before you make a point, set it up. And then after you make the point, tie down how important it is. Say your point that you want to make is that the question is more important than the answer. So like if somebody's struggling with a challenge, you can say, hey, listen, knowing the right questions to ask is even more important than having the right answers. That's the payoff. So how do we set that up, right? We could set it up the following way with a metaphor. We could say, hey, I want you to imagine one day you're walking in the desert and you find a genie, and the genie won't give you wishes, but he says, if you answer these 6 questions, then I'll tell you exactly what you need to do to succeed in life. Would you like to know what those 6 questions are? And the listener's going to lean in. They're going to be like, I want to know those 6 questions. So we set it up. So when we pay it off, you can say, here are the 6 questions that will help you the most. Now they're emotionally invested. And then at the end of that, to tie it down to increase its importance, you can say, once you understand these 6 questions, here's how it can show up in your life. And here's how it can benefit you in this way, and this way, and that way. You have to make less points this way. You can make a very few points, but the setup, payoff, tie down, next point, setup, payoff, tie down, easiest formula I know to increase the effectiveness of your communication. Finally, script the last words that you're going to say on the podcast and then transition that into a call to action. There's this thing called the peak end effect in psychology. And people will typically, if the end is really good, then they will value the rest of it. So they're not very objective. They're very subjective. Like if you end on a bang, then the whole thing was killer. But if you end on a whimper, the whole thing sucked. So if you want to nail anything, not only do you nail the introduction at the beginning, but you also nail the last thing. And then you make sure it transitions to the CTA. So you have the scripted last few words you're going to say to end it. And typically the podcast host will set you up. They'll say, any final words? And you say, as a matter of fact, I do. The next time that you sit down to consider XYZ, I want you to think firmly about the 3 things that we discuss here today. And as you reach for the 3 things, you can feel this sense of empowerment for you because you are now a new person when it comes to XYZ 1, 2, 3. And by the way, if you need help with any of this, I have the exact process map that we discussed here today. You can go to example.com. You can get it for free in just 1 click. And they're like, damn, okay, cool. And then they're running over there. And that sounds natural, but that whole thing should be scripted. And what will happen if you do this, not only will the podcast host be like, whoa, you're really good, which could open up deal flow for you, by the way, and referral sources, but then the end users will get more likely to respond to you. So you can build lists this way, get more leads, and close more sales. They'll come to you pre-closed more often. But you also will then be able to generalize this and use this communication structure in webinars, if you write articles in the articles for YouTube shorts and long form content just like this. So it works really well in podcasts, and then it generalizes equally as well. Podcasts are the best way, in my opinion, these days to get traffic, especially if you're in information-based niches. And even if you're not, there's still a killer way to explore. It's fun to talk about this stuff anyway. So why not get paid to talk about what you're passionate about? What was your best piece of advice that you got out of this video? Let me know in the comments. I'll catch you on the next one.